In essence, it changes the standard of review. A person should not be judged by a crime that was committed 38 years ago, 45 years ago, 49 years ago. A person should be judged and measured. His worth should be measured by who he or she is today. This bill will transform that standard and make that the law of the state. I also want to add that Mujahid Fareed passed away last November, and that he had named me his successor as the director of the Police Safety People in Prison. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm not going to be one to break a tradition like that. I also am mindful that I'm following two extremely compelling speakers, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and also for the opportunity to build on what you all have already said. Thank you so much, Senator, for having me to be part of this discussion. So my name is Ames Grauert. I'm Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Brennan Center, and then I'll launch into why I'm here and what I have to share with you all. So some of you in the New York State government might know the Brennan Center from our voting rights advocacy. You probably can't turn a corner in Albany without hearing the words automatic voter registration being uttered by one of my colleagues from the democracy side. We're known for our voting rights work, and that's vitally important, and as I think you all probably know, vitally linked up with the issue of mass incarceration. But I work on the criminal justice side of the Brennan Center. We work on ending mass incarceration and developing an understanding of what mass incarceration is, why we don't need it, how we can fix it. I'm here with my colleague Adure, who's a researcher on the team and is absolutely vital to that work as well. So the Brennan Center model is we don't do anything without research and advocacy first. We start with the numbers, we start with the facts, and then we build up an advocacy strategy based on that. So what does the research tell us about criminal justice in the United States? It tells us that despite the fact that we have the largest number of incarcerated people in the industrialized world, that our incarceration rate is higher than almost any peer nation, and depending on how you do the math, any other nation in the world. 40% of those people are there without any public safety justification. A report that we released a couple of years ago showed that that number, about 36 to 40%, depending on how you cut it, could be released tomorrow without an impact on public safety. The research tells you that our current level of incarceration is not some requirement of us being America. There's not some latent criminality in the American population. It's a policy choice. We made a decision that we're going to incarcerate people rather than doing something better to help them and better to build them up rather than strike them down. So we need to transcend that, and that's why I'm here. So I want to give you a little background on the problem, why it matters, and what we can do about it. So if there's one thing that the periodic review can take forward, the phrase mass incarceration has to appear in that document. And what we mean by mass incarceration is exactly what I just said, that we made a policy decision to incarcerate our people despite the presence of better options and better solutions for crime and punishment in the United States of America. Despite some recent progress, despite 7 years of declines in the incarceration rate, in some ways, the problem of mass incarceration is getting worse. The rate of incarceration for women has climbed dramatically over the last decades, at double the rate of the incarceration for men. And racial disparities are still continue to persist at the current rate of decline. While racial disparities are kind of dropping, at the current rate, it would take about 90 years for racial disparities in the criminal justice system to disappear. That's too long. We can't suffer, or we can't let our fellow Americans, our fellow human beings, suffer for that long. And also there's evidence that even in some communities, like New York City actually, where there's been remarkable progress on reducing unnecessary incarceration, racial disparities persist. I saw a presentation a couple of weeks ago where I think it was someone from Arnold Ventures noted that New York City has cut the number of people we send to prison dramatically. It's by all accounts, it's a criminal justice reform success story. At the same time, racial disparities persist at the same level at every step of the criminal justice system. So there's a lot of work left to be done. Even if we can't pat ourselves on the back, we can't look at drops in the prison population and say, good job, mission accomplished. We can't look at the First Step Act, which is a federal criminal justice reform bill that was passed last year, and say, first step, only step, done, move on. There's far too much to do. To give you a background on racial disparities, African Americans represent 12% of the adult population, but 33% of the sentenced prison population. Latino Americans are 16% of the population and 23% of incarcerated people. The incarceration rate for people of color is around 6 times the rate for whites, which is ridiculous. And that's not an accident. I think I think the senator alluded to this in his speech as well, but there was a conscious decision very early in our history after the Civil War to substitute one form of social control, incarceration and arrest, for another form of social control, slavery, which we just abolished. We put out a book of essays about the importance of criminal justice reform a couple months ago. My colleague Adora was vital in that effort, and I want to call her out again for that. But there was a comment by the president of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, and I don't want to steal his great quote. I got to give him credit for it. We've overutilized mass incarceration, he says, as a means of social control in lieu of economic opportunity, educational opportunity, and justice. That's exactly right. What happened in that decade after Reconstruction is states across the Old South passed laws that made it a crime to not have a job, made it a crime to be homeless, basically criminalized poverty. It's no surprise that the newly freed population was just trying to get on their feet after literally centuries of oppression, and more was still to come. So those laws allowed the ruling class to impose this different form of control on them, for lack of a better word. That was the beginning of race as an issue in the criminal justice system. It's by no means the end. To give you just a recent example of how race interplays with sentencing and incarceration in the U.S., up until 2010, crack cocaine offenses were punished at 100 times the severity of powder cocaine offenses, despite them being identical substances chemically. And the reason is there was widespread panic about the effect of crack in American cities, and it just so happened that the crack form of cocaine was much more popular among communities of color. To give you an example of what that 100-to-1 disparity looks like, I was talking to a reporter the other day. There's a case of a gentleman who was sentenced in 2007, I think it was, to life in prison for a crack cocaine offense. Life. This reporter asked us to do the math. Like, what would this person, if they had committed the exact same crime, exact same drug weight, exact same criminal history, but powder cocaine, the cocaine form most popular among the white community, 2 to 3 years. 2 to 3 years. Incredible. Like, that's what we're talking about when we talk about how race affects people. These are real people who are going to prison for life when they could be either diverted to drug treatment or receive a sanction that Congress has passed, but is not so racially disparate. There's some amount of work being done to fix that in the First Step Act that we actually worked on. It does some good toward that end. And sentencing and incarceration isn't the end of racial disparities in the justice system, as I think anyone in New York would know. We are barely a few years out of the end of the stop and frisk era, where people of color, of all colors, were more likely to be stopped on the street for minding their own business, and more likely to wind up in the pipeline to incarceration as a result of that. Because of the way policing works in the United States, police officers are not viewed as helpers or as allies in the community. Instead, they're viewed as opposing forces, people that aren't there to help or there to disrupt, and there's a history of abuse to back that up. We need to repair that as well. And I think something you're going to hear about more in this presidential campaign cycle, the 1984 crime bill, which led to the construction of prisons around the country, led to the incarceration of predominantly people of color. That's something that we're very slowly starting to unwind, but that damage took decades to build, and we're not going to undo it in a second. Nearly half, actually, by the way, of all people serving life or virtual life sentences are Black, and around 15% are Latino. Keep in mind in the context of the population figures I shared with you earlier. One of our other speakers alluded to criminal justice as an economic issue, and I want to underscore that, because when you lock up a person, you're not just locking up that person. No man is an island. That applies equally to anyone who's incarcerated. People who go to prison upstate or federal prison several states away leave behind families, leave behind children, and when they come back home, because I think it's upwards of 97% of people who are incarcerated will return to their communities, they come back to a life that they have to rebuild. But that's a lot harder than it looks like, or that's a lot harder than it seems. When you return to your community, you're saddled with the stigma of a criminal conviction. The overwhelming research consensus of sociologists and criminologists shows that it's significantly harder to get a job, a job that pays well with a criminal record, and especially with a record of incarceration. Depending on which research study you look at, people who have a criminal record can expect between 11 to 20% decreased earnings over their lifetime. We're working on research at the Brennan Center that I think will show that is a little higher. But that means that we're not just sentencing people to prison. We're not just convicting them for a very short amount of time. We're sentencing them to a punishment that will reverberate down the course of their life, have a significant effect on their ability to provide for their family, and devastate their communities. It's one of the reasons we need to rethink who we punish, why, and for how long. Families of incarcerated, or children of incarcerated parents are more at risk of bullying, more at risk of school disciplinary action, more at risk of food insecurity. Excuse me. 1 in 5 families face addiction because of a criminal justice involved family member. And I think we just need to appreciate that incarceration is not a one-off event for most people affected in this world. Because of the way these effects persist, too, I think we need to come to grips with the idea of criminal justice as something that perpetuates the racial. Yeah, let me get my water. I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Adair. My Marco Rubio moment. We need to come to grips with the idea of criminal justice as something that permanently depresses someone's ability to earn a living wage, and something that contributes to the racial wealth gap in the world and in this country, and broader income inequality. This is a time when we're talking more and more about income inequality and wealth inequality in this country. One important contributing factor to it is mass incarceration. So what do we do about it? Before turning it back to our next speakers, I want to talk a little bit about solutions that we're coming up with at the Brennan Center, because I know that one of the things we should be talking about here is not just the problem of mass incarceration, but what we do to fix it. The statistic I alluded to at the top of my presentation, about 40% of people being unnecessarily incarcerated, that should be a starting point for how we approach criminal justice reform. And that means we need comprehensive sentencing reform. Rather than tinkering around the edges, decreasing some federal drug sentences, which Congress finally came to grips with last December, we need across-the-board reductions in sentences for all sorts of crimes, violent crimes, property crimes, all of them. As was alluded to in the last speech, we need to not be afraid to touch the third rail of talking about sentencing reform for so-called violent offenders. That needs to be on the table. And Brennan Center research backs that up. This is more than a feeling. This is not just fly by the seat of our pants ideas. This is not just dreaming. We know, based on research that we've done, that we can safely cut prison sentences for almost all people in prison by around 25%, probably more, with no appreciable impact on public safety. We need to be working towards a system where that is the goal. And we need to make sure that happens across the country, because the federal system is not the only incarcerator. It's the most popular one to talk about, but there are 51 justice systems at a minimum around the country, and all of them need holistic change top to bottom. I think that's all I have to say for you all, but as we continue with our conversation today, I just want to make sure that the phrase mass incarceration, the problem of mass incarceration, what it entails, and the existence of solutions to it remain at the forefront of our work and our conversations today. And thank you again for the chance to have me.
when the subject matter gets so good, it's always a temptation to allow people to go on a little bit longer, but we do have a time constraint, and what I'd like to do is make a slight adjustment and allow you to get refreshments, but you will not get a break. And I'd like you to do that as quickly as possible so that we can move quickly into our next panel. Okay? Is that good? Never make me the moderator and give me a mic unless you. Okay, so we're gonna do that as quickly as possible and come right back. And if we don't talk, we can move faster. Because talking slows us down.